I just want to stop for a moment and just, so we recognize the difference. Guys, when we strive for a balance of grace and truth, here's what we get. Grace becomes conditional, and truth becomes subjective. When we strive for this balance of living out grace with the tension of truth, then grace becomes conditional and truth becomes subjective. You know how many marriages have ended because they wanted a balance of grace and truth? They didn't know any other way to solve the tension. And yet there was no way, whether it was the addiction to pornography or the emotional or physical betrayal of one spouse or the other, or the growing apart and hatred of communication with each other, that they didn't know how to resolve the tension and the mess between you're forgiven and you don't owe me, to no, you're wrong and you deserve, and there's consequences, and yeah, maybe there's more severe consequences for this than for this, and truth becomes subjective and grace becomes conditional. Well, if you do and you do and you do, then I will, and if you don't and you don't, then truth comes in. You know, addicts, doesn't matter whether you're substance or emotional or there's probably more sexual addicts nowadays than any because of pornography and the rise of that. You know, addicts have a very hard time when they try to find the balance of grace and truth because they know they're forgiven, but they're living through the consequences of their actions. They're living through the consequences of their addiction, but they keep hearing about forgiveness and a clean slate and all these things that grace offers, but grace is now conditional because they can't figure it out, and the truth becomes subjective because maybe it was so bad, but maybe it's not that bad because I don't know any other way to live, and all of a sudden they try to strive for this balance and they never go anywhere. People who are single, who are struggling to honor God with their sexuality. And I'll be honest, this affects singles, but it affects singles again in our culture more than anybody. Single again, meaning I've been married before, but now I'm divorced. Well, surely, Matt, surely you don't mean that this all the Bible talks about in terms of sex outside of marriage, and you're not supposed to do it, and surely that's not about me, because truth is now subjective. And grace is conditional. That if as long as it's not that bad, and as long as I'm not hurting anyone else but me, and as long as it's just me that's involved, as long as it's consensual, as long as all this happens, then grace can still be there when I strive for the balance of it. It's funny, whenever we have a PG-13 Sunday or we talk about sex here, it's like the most viewed video online out of all of our sermons, which is weird to me. Like, it's like people think that we're gonna, like, we found something new in the Bible and there's a new gospel that we didn't know about, and Jesus said, love the one you're with, and that's, no, I'm gonna just say some rule that just discounts everything else that's ever been said. And all of a sudden people they strive for this balance. I'm just telling you, we get nowhere. And I heard this said about 2 weeks ago, and I was sitting and listening to another guy talk, and I heard him make a statement about a generation of Christians, a generation of believers trying to strive, and this is in my words, trying to strive for this balance and not getting anywhere. We're basically looking at God and we're saying, look, just take my goodness and my badness and just take the average. And Paul says in Romans, he gives that warning. He says, what do we keep on sinning? I mean, is this really, are we supposed to just continue to live this life of sin so that grace can continue to be poured over us over and over and over again? And he's basically like, no, like expletive no. You got to read the Greek to really get the meat of it. Because we get nowhere. But here's Jesus. John says Jesus comes and he's full. He's full of this thing that causes the mess. He's full of this natural tension between grace and truth. And in this fullness brings two things. It doesn't, no longer is grace conditional and truth subjective. When we're living in the fullness and we see this experience in Jesus, grace brings actual hope. I don't know if you know this or not, but sin has a getcha. Sin has a getcha. So that when you mess up or you slip up, then sin goes, I gotcha. Like that. Right? And without the fullness of grace and the fullness of understanding that there's nothing I can do to make God love me any more than he already does, and there is nothing that I have done or will do that will make him love me any less. Unless we understand the fullness of grace, then there is no hope for the gotcha. And yet we live in the fullness of truth, which means that we're accountable. Living out the fullness of truth is understanding why we're good stewards of our lives. Why it is that we follow God's commands and rules. Why it is that we tithe. Why it is that we give regularly. Why it is that we come to church. Why it is we go and be a part of communities. Why we serve others outside the church. Why we serve each other as a family. Why we are accountable at the end of our life. That's all there is to it. The Bible makes it extraordinarily clear. You're either a good steward or a bad one. There's no middle ground. There's no middle ground. So living out the fullness of our life is telling people our weakness and how we keep messing up and the fact that we don't live the way we're supposed to live, but we're trying. And the reality is that we can't even do it. We need the power of Christ in us to do it. That's the fullness of it. That's the way I'm living. I'm living in the fullness of truth, which means I'm wrong and I'm broken and I can't do it and I'm inadequate, but I need a Savior, and the grace and the fullness that I'm given tells me that there's hope. There's hope.